Welcome, everybody. I'm Greg Slobodkin, editor-in-chief of scienceboard.net. And as part of our continuing interview coverage of the industry, we have another KOL with us today. I am pleased to have Debrah Thompson, who is Vice President of Research and Technology at HTG Molecular Diagnostics. Welcome, Deb.
Thank you, Greg. It's good to be here today.
So it's great to have you here. I feel like with where we're at in the current pandemic, there's a lot of retrospection going on. People are looking at, sort of the lessons learned from the pandemic and what the lessons are and what they might be for the industry. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Operation Warp Speed, but just sort of take a look at, the drug discovery process and the way it currently exists. Why is it so expensive, time consuming, and often inconclusive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I feel that there's been a lot of ink spilled on that question in the past, right? And lately I've been reading a lot of pitch decks from early stage companies who are really interested in how do we change that paradigm? It takes so long to make a drug. It is so time consuming and so money consuming. And, the big question is how do we change the attrition rate? You have compounds that come in, they don't come out the other side because they fail at some point. And one thing that HTG has been doing very recently, we've started a therapeutics group, and we are interested in how can we bring some data to bear earlier in the process to try to mitigate some of that risk. And the whole reason to do any of this is that you have patients who are waiting for these treatments. Do they need to wait for 15 years because a treatment has failed in phase 1 3 times? And the really cool thing about Operation Warp Speed was that we took a lot of risks, but we also, I truly believe that we also showed that you can move very, very swiftly without compromising quality.
And so in terms of the lessons learned from the COVID vaccine rollout, how do you see them being applied to the current drug discovery process?
Yeah, and I think that's a little bit difficult to completely parse because you're talking about a smaller focused project and kind of a larger industry. But I think there were 5 things about Operation Warp Speed that we could take away. First of all, there was a really strong social mission, so everyone wanted to work on this. There was a lot of time pressure. There was really specific focus. And then I think also very importantly, there was a willingness to take risks and fail. So the government backed 6 or 7 different vaccines, knowing full well that some of them would fall out. So we got very lucky with the mRNA vaccines, really cool technology. It kind of met its perfect time and place. But we were willing to take a risk. And then, of course, there was money. You can't pretend that money doesn't exist and it's not a big motivating factor. But yeah, there were a lot of motivations that I think made very many people really focus on solving this problem.
And in terms of, Operation Warp Speed, I guess there's multiple reasons, and you've talked about a few of them, but what was the critical part and that ensured the success of the rollout of the vaccines?
I truly think that the biggest thing that we brought to the table there was data. I'm a big proponent of how do you use data and the data you already have. You don't need to go looking for it. You already have it. How do you use that and really apply it to a problem in a novel way? So there was a great technology in terms of RNA vaccines, but we also had all of these experts who understood coronaviruses. They knew exactly, we're going to target the spike protein. Here's the sequence. We were able to get that right away. We had people who had probably been wargaming coronavirus infection series for years, right? We were able to take advantage of all those data that were out there and put them together to say, here's what we think we need to go after. Here's what we're going to need to do first. Maybe we kind of missed the boat on the public education part because that's a little bit of a problem too. I don't know how you solve that problem, but I really do like the idea of applying data streams early on in the process, all along the process, making the whole thing very data-driven and focused so that when you get to the point where you're going to the FDA, you say, here's the whole package. Here's everything that we know.
And you mentioned data. How can data be used more intelligently and effectively to find, the path of least resistance in the development of drugs, vaccines, and other life-saving treatments?
Yeah, and I have a great example of how I feel that data has been used very recently in a clinical trial. And this is where I have to look at dostarlimab. Okay, so it's an anti-PD-1, it's an immunotherapy drug. And immunotherapy drugs have been really, really exciting. But a lot of these clinical trials that you do, a lot of patients don't respond. And no one can quite figure out why. So there was a recent trial in renal cancer patients. They had 12 people, and these were patients who had not been pre-treated. And that's really rare for an experimental technique, right? Usually you have people who it's either on the standard of care or it's heavily pre-treated patients. So people who are, it's kind of like the last ditch effort. But the investigators who put this trial together, they had observed in previous trials that people with certain mutations tended to respond very well to this drug. And they really wanted to try this as a frontline therapy on some of these particular patients. So they were able to finally get a sponsor. They had 12 patients in the trial. All of them had a complete response. All of them were completely cancer-free after 6 months. And when you look at what the lesson learned there was, we had a drug. It didn't work that well on a general population, but for a select population of people, it worked perfectly. And this was a great example of using data to find the perfect patient population for your drug. And maybe that's what we do going forward. We use companion diagnostics, we use pathway analysis, we figure out how we're going to find the right patients for these drugs. And I think it behooves us to do this. We have a pipeline that's very, very leaky. Not all of these drugs can possibly be bad for everybody. There's got to be a population you can put them into.
I wanted to ask you about the data. What kind of data are we talking about? And do you feel like in the current environment that data is being fully utilized, and perhaps maybe there are other sources of data that can be tapped that heretofore have not been utilized?
I think that's the biggest question. How can we use data better going forward? And so HTG does RNA profiling, right? And we have contracted with lots of pharma companies to look at FFPE samples from clinical trials that have failed. And they're trying to find out, could we find a better biomarker? Could we salvage something? But I fear that in a lot of cases, by the time the data get back to them, they've already moved on to the next drug. Their teams have dissolved, they're gone, right? So there are data out there that people aren't looking at. And when HTG looked at where do we want to position ourselves in therapeutics, we kind of decided to go after early stage compound design for two reasons. One, there's already a cycle, kind of a failure. You test a compound, you decide it doesn't look that good, you go back and redesign. So we've decided to put in some RNA profiling data at that stage to kind of bolster the information that's already there. I didn't realize this at the time, but the other really great thing about working in that early compound design space is that there's been 20 years of cheminformatics that have made designing libraries a lot more precise. So we can take advantage of both of those stages. And we just did a small study, and I was actually really amazed. We had a couple of compounds that were very, very similar. Like you could overlap them and there was just a couple of tiny changes. And yet when we put those on cells and looked at the RNA profiles, they did completely different things. One of them looked like it was having a toxic effect. One of them shut down the cell cycle. Another one didn't do anything. If all we had was the traditional data, we would know that all three of those compounds bound to the target. We would know something about whether they caused apoptosis, but we wouldn't know any of that stuff in the middle. And when I looked at this study, my thesis going in was this is going to tell us a lot, but even I was stunned at how much it told us. And I think that's an easy example of just showing you can bring in a new data stream. It doesn't need to be hard to get data. You just need to use it.
So is it fair to say that you see the redesign of molecules for drug trials, research, and perhaps even abandoned projects as a more time and cost efficient option than starting from scratch, say?
I think that would be a great niche. I mean, when you think about it, you already know something about the compound. You already know what you didn't like. The only problem there is, there's IP, there's money, there's, people thinking about how do we use this molecule before our IP protection runs out. So maybe you need to bring in some foundations or some government money, so non-industry money, in order to get those kinds of projects started. Once they succeed, I feel like success is its own thing. And so maybe more people would take that up. So I think it's a great idea. I'm not sure that the drug discovery machine is quite ready for that, though. So we may need to find alternative sources of funding.
Yeah, I mean, the other hot topic in the industry is repurposing of drugs. And, AI, machine learning are being used to help, identify existing drugs that might be applied to, diseases and unmet needs. What do you see in that area?
I think that is so exciting. That's the kind of thing that makes me excited to get up in the morning. And even during Operation Warp Speed, there were a couple of drug repurposing initiatives that were done to find things that might target the COVID virus. And those were quite successful. I thought that was really interesting. Again, I think it comes down to how do you give industry a way to make some money off of that so they'll put the money into doing it? Otherwise, it's just an academic exercise. But with the wealth of data that we have, using machine learning to kind of have that conversation between compounds and what they're doing, I think it's a fantastic idea.
The other thing is I've heard government officials, FDA officials, talk about the need for an Operation Warp Speed type initiative in different areas, especially in helping to address rare diseases.
Sure.
Because it seems like there's a lot of emphasis on, common diseases or diseases that are more prevalent. So it seems like, the Operation Warp Speed model definitely got attention. It's seen as sort of the case model for how to proceed, but it seems also like it's got to involve more than just government funding.
Yeah. I think for those rare diseases, though, what I've seen more and more of is you get foundations that are popping up that have a little private money. If they can be very focused on how they use that money, they can be very, very effective. Because I think with those rarer diseases, you're not really dealing with so much of a background problem where, okay, I have cancer. Well, cancer, that's a huge number of diseases. It's not one disease, but a rare disease allows you to really focus. And I do think, yes, we're going to have to bring in some private money. Maybe you have public-private partnerships. Maybe you start off with a grant between a private or an academic institution and a pharma company. But yeah, I think one of the biggest problems is really, how do you fund this stuff? I think there are lots of ideas, but how do you get that funded and make it? Again, someone's going to have to sell this drug and make money off of it. If that ends up being a foundation and we change the paradigm, I think that's an awesome idea.
Absolutely. Anything else that we didn't touch on that you think is important to mention as it relates to, an Operation Warp Speed type initiative or just in general about, more efficiently using data?
I don't have anything really major to say, but I will say this. I think the more that we can figure out how to use the data that we have, not storing it, not putting it in a database, but actually saying, what does this mean? I think the better off we're going to be. And there are so many opportunities. There's never been a better time. There's so much out there. It's very exciting.
Well, thanks, Deb. I appreciate your time. And it's an important and timely topic. And we'll definitely be watching to see what develops in the industry going forward.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Greg.